This is not a typical video, at least not for me. It's a little outside the norm, so bear with me here. But back in 2020, just before some strange happenstance, and I can't quite remember why, sent a lot of us home for a long period of time, I had kind of turned my attention away from academic program building and a little bit of light commercial illustration, and gone into illustrating a graphic novel. That graphic novel, which was called Theseus and is now more than 400 pages, and I'm actually just about to wrap it up. I self-published a couple of volumes of that through Kickstarter, and then web sales, spending time at conferences, and I had a chance meeting with a comic writer at one of these. He'd done work for Marvel, and now he was kind of settling in with indie work. And then that fall, which was in 2023, he contacted me and he asked me if I would be interested in working on something very different than what I had done so far. A project telling the life story of a real historical figure who was assassinated in 2011, working for minority religious rights in Pakistan. I was very intimidated by this. And after weighing it and talking it over with my wife and making space within my full-time job as best I could, I did take the contract. And for the first time ever, I found myself working with a team on a graphic novel. And I was fascinated by this because if you're like me, I always wondered how that side of things looked. I had always been the director of my own creative efforts from the time I was a teenager. A team, funding for a project, these were all novelties to me. And that project took a year to complete. It was a 111-page graphic novel called Blood and Water, The Life and Martyrdom of Shahbaz Bhatti. That book is just about to release with Ignatius Press, and what I have here in this video is a conversation of me asking questions of the others on that team. If you're like me, and the world of projects getting made always feels opaque and difficult to picture, hopefully this gives you some insight into working with others, what gets a project off the ground, and even the place of graphic novels in the modern media landscape. All that to say, here's the interview, and if this is something you're interested in, I hope you get something from it. There's a link to Ignatius's website where the book is available for pre-order in the description below. In 2023, I was contacted to work on a graphic novel about the life of Shahbaz Bhatti, who I had never heard of, and now at this point I'm shocked to realize that I had never heard of him, because the story and the international movement of that story is really significant looking at the records afterwards. And now, after the project is done, we have the opportunity to do a little bit of retrospective, talk about some things that we didn't actually talk about during the production, and for my sake, pull back the veil somewhat and see what it was like from your perspective, because I was very locked into my illustration side of it. But I'm going to give you each a chance to kind of introduce yourself and describe what your role was, because my estimation of your role might actually be quite a bit shallower than the reality of what you were doing behind the scenes. So I want to hear each of you talk about it, and then we'll get into some general questions, and I'll jump around kind of from each of you and just see what your responses are to my curiosities about what happened during the production of this and what kind of experience it was for you to work on this book. So Knox, would you lead us off and give us an introduction to yourself and your role on the project?
Yeah, thanks for hosting us. At Knox Thames, for 20 years, I worked in different diplomatic capacities representing the United States to promote religious freedom worldwide. Spent a lot of time focusing on Pakistan, a country of incredible diversity, but a very fractured place, a very broken place, a lot of religious persecution happening there that impacts Christians, but also others like Hindus, Shia, Ahmadis, and even members of the majority Sunni Muslim faith. In that work, that's when I got to know Shahbaz Bhatti. He had been a courageous advocate in the community, creating something called the All Pakistan Minorities Alliance to bring together all these different groups from different theological backgrounds to say, no, we should be treated as equal citizens. We should not be discriminated against or be targeted for our faith. And eventually he was appointed to be a cabinet member in 2008, the only Christian in the federal cabinet of Pakistan to focus on religious minorities in the country. And that's where I really got to know him well. He became a friend. I was so impressed with his courage, his commitment to advocate for his own community and for people from other communities, and just living out the best of what it meant to be a civil servant, but also a Christian. He was a devout Catholic, and his faith, his commitment to Jesus Christ, was center to everything he did. And tragically, the forces of darkness took notice that he was having success, and on March 2nd, just a few days from now, 15 years ago, he was killed outside his mother's house. He was assassinated. And it was a dark, dark day for those of us who knew and loved and respected him. So I was really pleased that the Templeton Religion Trust, thanks to some advice that Mandi gave about, let's try to capture his story in the format of a graphic novel, which, I have a comic book collection back from high school, but that's been about the extent of my engagement in that medium. Although I had seen my boys when they were younger just love the action Bible, that turned the Bible into a graphic comic format, and was really intrigued by this idea that Mandi told me about as a way to kind of get his stories out to the next generation and to inspire, to educate them about his life and his sacrifice, and then to inspire us all to think about, okay, what do we do in this moment now when there's still a pandemic of persecution that's impacting members of every faith community somewhere? How do we pick up Shahbaz's flame and carry it forward? And I think that's the question that this book, thanks to all three of you, really asks and challenges us to consider.
Sure. All right, Mandi, give us a little introduction to you and what you did for this project.
Sure. So I had the role of essentially project manager. So between recruiting and then hiring Matt to do the writing and reaching out to Jordan to secure you as our artist and our letterer as well. And then every other kind of piece of the project that needed to be done, kind of the legal and paperwork side, and then making sure that both scripts and art were coming in accordance with the plan and with the story itself. And then when we got to the point of publishing, making sure that we delivered all the files that they needed and taking care of the legal paperwork for that as well. So it was a real gift to be able to take this journey with all of you at all steps of the project. And now as we anticipate the public release, also anxiously awaiting what our distribution will look like and just the reception of the book to the audience in the months ahead.
Yeah, I guess in many ways the work isn't quite over yet because there is kind of a management of that publishing, distribution, etc. I mean, I feel much less burdened at this point, but not everybody might have that leeway here at the end of the project. Matt, why don't you give us an introduction and a description of your role?
Sure. So similar to Knox's background, I had a career that originated in government service. So I was a lifelong Air Force officer, served 30 years, and retired 2.5 years ago. But preceding even my time in the military, I began a life as a fiction writer, writing short stories and submitting to magazines and, what have you for years, parallel to my time in the military. About halfway through my military career, I made a pivot when it came to my fiction writing from, prose, short stories, and eventually wrote my first novel. But I pivoted over to comics. I'd always been a lifelong comics reader and collector, which I say that deliberately as two separate things because I did read everything that I bought, but I also became an avid collector. And then that's when I made a decision. I think I want to try my hand at writing comics, and had some initial success. I wrote my first entry professionally was doing some stuff for Marvel, including Avengers and some Wolverine stuff and a few other side stories. But with limited time because of my military career, I realized I need to find a way to work at the pace that is allowable to me based on my military life. And so that meant independent comics. At the same time, there was a huge rise in independent comics and a lot of successes that were happening in that realm. And so I began to work kind of on my own stories. And where the two kind of came together was my ultimately, my career in the Air Force, I became a regional specialist for the Middle East. The command, the U.S. command that deals with the Middle East also includes Central and South Asia, and that's U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM. And I served multiple commanders of that, which are 4-star generals, which are the senior most rank in the military. And so I became their lead writer. That meant traveling to every country in the Middle East and in Central and South Asia, including the stands, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, and so on. The only country, of course, that I never made it to is Iran, of course. But that did include a number of trips to Pakistan. And after Mandi and I had begun, after I had met her and the folks that she works with, I began to talk a lot with them about the industry and what I was working on and insights into what was going on in the industry. And then after some time of that, she reached out and said, I know this guy, Knox Thames, who's got a grant to tell the life story of Shahbaz Bhatti. I know you've been to Pakistan a number of times. Would you be interested? So Jordan, like you, I didn't know about Shahbaz, to my regret. As a Christian, I was not familiar with his story. And, even just scratching the initial surface, you realized just how monumental his life was. When you got below the surface, you realized how extraordinary his life was from beginning to end. And so I very much embraced this story. And it was, honestly, it was not a question of, it became a question of, what do I leave out? There's so much material in his life to mine from. And in the page count that we had, it was, we realized things are going to have to be sacrificed in the telling of his story. So that's ultimately how I got involved, and then one of my initial challenges in putting this story together.
Yeah, which we'll probably dig into that a little bit as we go forward, because that's one of my curiosities. I did not envy you throughout the entire process at having to piece that together and make it coherent, which in reading it afterwards, it was clear that it had become coherent. So that's quite a testament to your ability to do that. But you actually, Knox, I think it was you who mentioned in that part that Mandi kind of persuaded you a little bit towards the graphic novel idea. And you said you had a comic collection when you were growing up. Was it a little hard to imagine this fitting into a graphic novel context? Was that an easy shift for you?
Yeah, I think it was, because the fact that I'm in my early 50s and I still have my comic book collection shows you just the sort of power of this visual medium for young people. They're all G.I. Joe comic books, back in the day. And I saw, like I said, my sons really gravitate towards, they read the Bible through pictures. That was just what they were attracted to. And, if that counts for reading the Bible through, they've read the Bible through 20 times because it was so arresting, the pictures and the stories. And so Mandi and I had talked a bit about, can we make a movie script about his life? But, that's such a steep hill to climb, so uncertain. And she told me about her work in the graphic novel space. And I had worked with Mandi on telling the story of the 21 martyrs out of Egypt in a graphic comic style mini movie. So I was all in for it and, knew nothing about your all's world. And so it's been a fun journey to learn about lettering and coloring and how you do the page spacing with the bubbles. As a consumer, I've never thought about that once, but just I have a lot deeper appreciation for the artistry that you guys have perfected and are continuing to perfect.
Yeah. Well, I'll never miss an opportunity to quote Pope Gregory I, and he's the one who gives sort of the image as a way of reading Scripture for those who are illiterate in many ways. Now, teenagers may not be illiterate, but we know that there's a certain aid that's given through the image that might be more difficult for them to parse through text, and images are powerful. They just are. So all jokes aside, images are powerful.
My sense of this book is, I think, going to reach a new audience with this message of why we should stand up for anyone who's facing religious persecution, is how my two now teenage boys responded. One's a freshman in college, one's a junior in high school. And I write articles all the time about these issues. They don't read them, they don't comment on them. I put the picture of the book on Instagram, and they both immediately messaged me saying, "Can I get a copy?"
Oh,
And for me, that was just like incredibly like affirming that this is going to really introduce this important topic to young people who otherwise wouldn't encounter it in a way that's going to be attractive to them.
yeah. And Mandi, since you did some of the work of persuading him as to the possibility and value of a graphic novel, this is a question that I genuinely had before we ever sort of encountered each other, and something I think a lot of the people who watch my channel and the stuff about art would be curious about. What is the value of a graphic novel right now? Why is it an advantage? Why was this a good option for this book?
Yeah. Yeah, so my background is actually in film production, and I came to the graphic novel format kind of later through the launching of a small indie publishing company called Cave Pictures Publishing, and that was really my kind of entry into the medium and into the industry. But it's been fascinating over the years to learn more both about the industry and the medium itself, and we launched Cave Pictures Publishing as basically an incubator for intellectual property that would ultimately be adapted into the film format, because you can produce a graphic novel at a lower price point than commissioning a feature film script from a WGA, a Writers Guild writer. But the graphic novel it's sellable. You can monetize it. You can begin to build an audience for your IP. It does allow you to incubate a story and to some extent define a visual style, all of which is a great kind of journey down the path of development for film or for other formats of entertainment and of content. And so it kind of leapfrogs the traditional film development process, gets you further down the road, and just has a lot of perks if you're going to pitch a particular story for adaptation into other formats like film or games, because you've built the audience, you've got something that you can monetize, and it's all costs less than a WGA script.
And that's extremely interesting to me. Is that something that is relatively widespread at this point, or are there a lot of people talking about it in that way? Because that's fantastic news for people who draw comics, if that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you think about the cultural footprint of comics just in kind of two, I can give you 5 letters, DC, MCU.
Yeah.
In those 5 letters between the DC universe and Marvel Cinematic Universe, you've got a massive cultural footprint. Now, granted, those are primarily superhero comics, but comics really do punch above their weight when it comes to the cultural power. And those are 2 isolated examples. There's a lot of other examples we could look at, even that are kind of more literary in nature. There are series that have been adapted as well. I mean, I think of Watchmen immediately, and Matt probably has some that he could think of offhand as well. A lot of examples of IP, of intellectual property, that started life as either a comic series or a graphic novel and then gets adapted into other formats. And that's all kind of assessing graphic novels and comics, their value relative to film, but they also have value just in and of themselves. It is not a small thing to take an idea for a story and to get it produced in some format that can reach an audience. So to do that in either a comic or graphic novel form is a huge accomplishment, because you are able to reach the audience that you're trying to reach with a story. They're getting an increasing footprint in schools and libraries, so more and more readers are engaging with that particular format, and there's more recognition within the broader culture and within the publishing space as well, with the different awards that are given to comics and graphic novels every year. I mean, it's possible to win some of the top literary awards with a graphic novel. So many memoirs that have been written and other kind of genres that are in a graphic novel format, but there's still high literary art.
That's interesting. I hadn't quite thought of that. There are levels of advantage that I hadn't even considered. But given that superheroes did get mentioned, Matt, you wrote this, and as you said, you've written Avengers, Wolverine. This probably was different I'm going to assume that this was a little different in the way that you approached it. So what were the key differences in writing something like, I mean, obviously still a graphic novel, obviously still a comic, but how did you approach it differently? Did you worry about being able to be appropriately serious, I suppose, in the way that the story required? I worried about that in the artwork. I worried every day about that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
That's a great question. Let me flip it real quick and tell you similarities, and then I'll tell you where there's a difference. Because it seems less obvious that there would be similarities between Shahbaz's life and, let's say, writing Avengers, or let's say writing a Spider-Man story. But the similarity is that, especially for Marvel and DC, these particular characters have such a long history that the editors understand they have a responsibility, not just to today's readers, but to tomorrow's readers. And they have a responsibility to the legacy of the character. So what that means is the editor is going to identify what is the core theme of that character. We all know what it is for Spider-Man. With great power must also come great responsibility. And so each of these different characters has a theme, and we're dancing around a wheel. If in the middle of the wheel is the theme, then all of us who are writing Spider-Man or Avengers or Wolverine are dancing around the wheel, telling that theme, but just with different plot lines and different side characters and so on and so forth. But there's a responsibility to the legacy of the character for future readers. So I can't come in as an unknown or a lesser known writer to Marvel and say, I've got a great story. It's going to start with the death of Spider-Man. And then we're going to go from there. We're going to introduce a new Spider. Like, I'm not that guy that they're going to hire to write that story. So you're going to be telling a different version of a Spider-Man story, but around the core theme. So that's what I felt was a similarity with Shahbaz. There is a responsibility that we have, especially those of us who learned about Shahbaz later, to pass on the life that he lived and the legacy that he created to future readers. When Mandi and Knox had said this is going to be for a younger readership to inspire them, that's when I realized we have a responsibility to his legacy, to try to inspire them. So what is that theme? And that theme for me was boldness and compassion. That was the theme. Now we have to tell his life story with that in the center. Now here's the big, big difference. I didn't get to make up anything in dancing around the wheel of a Spider-Man story. I get to make it up. I get to look what's on the wheel, what's been said in the past, and come up with a new plot line. That was not the case. Here there was also a responsibility for accuracy, in addition to creative storytelling. So it wasn't just all leaning on the creative storytelling side. It was also a responsibility to accuracy and getting the details right. That made it, to be honest with you, a much harder task, because I needed to really dive in and spend time using whatever resources available to get the details right. But again, there's a limitation in how many pages you and I had to tell this story. So what to emphasize? If we wanted to say everything, we would have had a different moment of his life on every page. But we know, as good storytellers, every now and then we've got to slow down, we've got to linger on certain scenes and let you really get to know who Shahbaz was. So the similarities were the theme, but the differences were, this wasn't make-believe. This was real life. And the responsibility that you and I had to tell it as accurately as we could.
Yeah, I definitely had one night where I was just trying to figure out what kind of cars were driven in the early 1980s, late 1970s in Pakistan. And I was kind of sweating over it a little bit. So there's this sense of, like, even in the small things, I want to draw this panel properly. I want to treat it properly. But there's this responsibility that engenders a natural humility, I think.
Yeah.
And you actually mentioned something I was about to ask Knox about too, about the audience, because you mentioned young readers. So Knox, why the emphasis on young readers? Why inspiring young people? Did that seem like the right fit for this particular story?
I think it's partly the timing. Like, we had this inflection point coming up on March 2nd, the 15th anniversary. Yeah. So it's a time when people will be, those who remember him will be honoring him. But also, just as someone who's been in this space focusing on how to promote religious freedom around the world for almost 25 years now, the challenge is enormous. Like the amount of persecution that people experience for how they pray or what they believe or don't believe is overwhelming. But I'm not hopeless, because when I see the next generation get engaged, like there's other people who feel called to this work to put their shoulder to the wheel. And I really hope and pray that this book will be just another kind of on-ramp for young people, a way that they can, and their level of maturity and their interests can see, oh, here's someone who stood up for what he believed, where he was. He paid the ultimate price, but there are things that I can do where I am to speak up for the least of these, to be a good neighbor, to demonstrate that I care for people because God cares for people. And I think his story he just lived it. And thanks to you guys, it's been told in a way that I think will be engaging to young readers. It will reach young readers in a way I never could in my medium of policy articles and whatnot. So I'm really excited to see how it's received. And I think it also has the opportunity to really live on. These books will bounce around. They'll be used in schools and book fairs. So yeah, I'm just really thrilled about how it turned out.
Mandi, since you worked on the film that was already mentioned, the 21, right? Which maybe I'll put a little clip over or something like, so that we can get a look at it. But then also this project, and I'm assuming many others that you've probably been a part of or been somewhere in the mix of behind the scenes getting things done so that things can be produced. My assumption is you've developed something of an eye for what appeals to audiences at this stage, even within this kind of framework of a particular genre that you tend to focus in. What gave you some kind of confidence that this would appeal to audience, or what was the angle on Shahbaz you felt like would most appeal to audiences?
Yeah. Well, it helps to have funding. That's always helpful for a project when you got the money to actually produce it. But aside from that, I mean, Shahbaz is just such an incredible person, such an incredible advocate. I mean, to Knox's point, we live in an age of increased religious persecution around the world against various faiths. And so it's more and more important that the world understand, and maybe particularly within the United States, that we understand the plight of persecuted religious minorities around the world and do something about it. And so to have a hero who lived a mostly anonymous life here in the West up to now. Hopefully this book will help alleviate some of that ignorance, but a mostly anonymous life within the global context. But he had such a huge impact. And it's interesting that the young audience we're trying to reach, they have a real passion for justice and a real kind of activist impulse, but oftentimes that's limited to posting on social media or reposting, but not actually doing something, taking action in the real world, even if there might be an interest in that. Shahbaz really did stuff. Knox mentioned he built 2 institutions within Pakistan, and that's just 2 examples of the many actions that he took, where he really did spend his life for the least of these, up to the very end. And so that story in and of itself is really compelling. And as we thought about the setting as well, not just in Pakistan, but his trips kind of around the world, there was a lot of visual content within his story that would make for a really compelling graphic novel. I mean, that's a really important question to ask for any visual storytelling medium. Is there enough here visually that will make the depiction of the story interesting and appealing and kind of monetizable, again, sellable, and And I felt like Shahbaz's story, absolutely, between the setting there in Pakistan and then his trips around the world, and the fact that we'd have kind of cameos, in a sense, from very well-known global leaders like President Obama and Hillary Clinton and various congressional representatives and other world leaders. That's a really interesting just little hook within the story itself. So I would say it in part has to do with your budget and funding sources that are available. Who's the audience, and are they actually going to be drawn to this story? Is the story inherently compelling enough? Is the visual component of the story interesting, and will that be eye-catching on a shelf? And then what does it look like to promote it? That's the last piece, that for this story in particular, I mean, Knox certainly has a much larger network within the global religious liberty advocacy world, but even within our own network, myself and my business partner in More Productions, and then knowing that both you and Matt had connections within the comics world and graphic novel publishing space, it felt like we would have a great opportunity to get the word out to a lot of overlapping audiences to try and build a following for the book.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people who are working in more independent media, the struggle is promotion. Like, a big part of the struggle is promotion. Because even if I sit in my basement and I remove the funding issue by just working in the evenings, producing something, finding a way to talk about it is difficult in a competitive space. So I think that's one of the challenges all of us run into inevitably. With this extremely complex story, Matt, you already talked a little bit about kind of trying to piece it together and knowing that you had to trim some things out, right? And for this, you did meet with, was it just his brother, Peter Bhatti, that you met with?
That's right.
Can you tell me what that meeting was like? Because I'm curious, how did you approach something like that when you're talking to a family member and that's a font of information? How did you filter through in order to get enough information that you could put together a good, solid, and honest and sincere and faithful story?
There was a trip that Peter was taking. He lives in Canada. He's lived in Canada for quite some time. And so when Knox had reached out to indicate Peter was going to come down for an event down in the Washington, D.C. area, that's not too far from me. That's a 5.5, 6 hour drive. So we agreed that I would come out there and get a bit of time to spend with Peter, and then also his nephew, or Peter's son, so Shahbaz's nephew, David, was going to be in town, and that's what was drawing Peter down for. So I was going to get some time with his nephew. There's a couple of things when I approached that particular visit. Number one was I wanted to make sure that Peter knew my seriousness with the project and with his brother's story. I wanted him to feel comfortable. I wanted him to almost approve that, yes, this is the guy I want telling my brother's story. And then, of course, I had, number two, I had all the questions that I needed to get through to both understand not just details about Shahbaz's life, but insights into him as a person. Because it's not enough to just tell this story like an encyclopedia and just say this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It was to bring him to life. And I could really only do that by talking to Peter about, what is Shahbaz like? Is he serious? Is he funny? If he's funny, how is he funny? Is he a cut up? Is it a dry sense of humor, or a satirical sense of humor, or things like, is he more serious than not? Things like that. Now, when it came to the first thing about the seriousness, number one, I needed to do some homework already to show, I've done some due diligence on this. But number two, the biggest thing is the loss of my own brother. Mm-hmm. Like, I had lost my brother years ago in a violent way. And so I know what that's like. I know the pain of losing your brother. I remember the day that it happened and I got the call. And so, having been on the receiving end of a phone call myself, I wanted him to know, I know what that call is like. I also know, because of my own loss, that everybody's relationship and experience on the backside of that phone call is different. In this case, it was Peter's and my brother. For my mom, the day that my brother passed, she's his mother. It was my dad's son. Every relationship is different with that person. And so every loss and the way we deal with grief is very different because everybody's relationship is different. I wanted him to understand that I understand that. I wanted Peter to understand that. And I think that helped him recognize, I know what, again, my brother didn't have this kind of outsized legacy that his did, but it doesn't mean he didn't have a legacy with his kids, of course, and with later, he'd never met them, but later his grandkids. And so I think that Peter did recognize that in me. And so that allowed him to realize that, hey, I take this very, very seriously. But then, of course, like I said, I needed to get some details. And it really helped that the meeting that we had, both with Peter and then I think it was that night we went out to dinner with David, and I got some insights from David to learn his relationship with Shahbaz, his uncle. It was really nice because Peter, stayed in contact, and he allowed me to continue to ask questions, to fill in gaps of things that just were not clear to me. So, but there was a moment I will share with you that Peter and Knox and I were in the room, and as we began to talk as we marched forward in time up until the moment of Shahbaz's death, those were some emotional moments in that hotel room as the three of us just mourned the loss of Shahbaz. And it was a very, very powerful moment. And again, it even further heightened the importance of telling this story in a powerful way to capture the powerful life that he had.
Yeah. With my students, I sometimes take a little bit of flack for criticizing the concept of self-expression. But the one reason why I do that is because self-expression is sometimes interpreted as this way of distinguishing yourself from others. What you're describing is much more what I think it ought to be, which is connecting with others. There's a bridge that's made through art. There's a bridge that's made through literature. And when that becomes a way in which you can mourn together, when you can celebrate together, and you can connect a human experience across oceans, that's really powerful. And that's what inspires me about the world of art and creating stories like this, that is so easy to miss. I feel like when a lot of independent artists especially, they kind of get stuck on their own head, and they think of it much more of digging inward instead of looking outward and creating that connection.
Let me finalize that while you're looking for that. And that is Knox's charge to make this inspirational. Yeah. Not just, this is not a memorial stone planted in the earth. We're not taking this graphic novel and making it his grave marker. And so it was important that we use it in a way that was not, I don't want to say just ending it on a down note, but making sure that people realized there's a reason that he was willing to die. And so making sure that it was inspirational. And especially for the youth of today, which I think Mandi made the point, a lot of people's activism comes out on social media, but we need more than that. We need people to take physical action for those who are hurting or those who are oppressed or persecuted. Prayer is, of course, one major element of that, but actually being the hands and feet of Christ around the world. So that was very, very important. Yes, we mourn his loss, but we also celebrate the legacy. We use it to encourage us and empower us to do more ourselves. We should look at a life like this as a model of inspiration, not as something to mourn and then we move on. And so that was something that was really helpful. When I finished it, Knox reminded me, hey, let's tweak the ending of this. We've got to make sure that we're inspiring people. So I was really grateful that Knox reminded me of that, because we could have just stopped it right there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to share that, before you go on.
Yeah.
And just to Matt's comment about that moment with Peter and Matt in that hotel room in Northern Virginia, like, I will never forget it, as we were kind of walking into that day, and just I mean, we were all crying, you know. It's powerful, emotional, meaningful. And on the point about inspiration, you know, one thing I was really happy Matt and I agreed on from the very first conversation was that this book is about Shahbaz. It's not against Pakistan, or it's not about the people who killed him and why they did it. It's about Shahbaz's life and his heroism and what it means for us. So it's not against other people or other faiths. It's about him and challenging the reader to think, okay, what can I take from his courageous life? His courageous life of conviction without compromise, and take forward.
Yeah. And Knox, given that you had a personal relationship with him, and also that creative projects were not something that you had spent your career doing, like many of us here have been associated with them one way or another, did you find it difficult to see the editing process as things had to be removed from the story? What was that like from your perspective?
You know, it's I've only read the entire thing, the finished product, through once, because it's just too hard.
Yeah.
You know, I know the ending, I know the man, and so that was kind of the heart. Like, you know, working with your edits, got to get it right. This is a month before. This is 2 weeks before. This was, you know, and I was a friend. I wasn't family members, and I saw this also just talking with the family members. Like, we're asking them to relive the worst day of their life and what was leading up to it. And so just being mindful of my own sort of emotional burden with it, and then helping that spur me to be aware of their even greater emotional burden. Like, I remember we talked with David and Natasha, and like, this is hard stuff, and it's not a story to them, you know, it's reality. So yeah, it was hard, but also really fulfilling, because I feel like we honored my friend well.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of that, and really appreciate you all helping us do that.
Yeah.
And the family appreciates it. I mean, that's the best thing. When I shared it with them, like, just knowing how honored they felt that we all were able to do this, and this foundation invested in it, like, that's awesome. I mean, that is just awesome.
Yeah. And from my perspective, again, coming in knowing so little, like just drawing those pages up towards the end of the book, both the ones that are tragic as well as the ones that are so optimistic at the end, I was moved consistently throughout it. Like, I actually found myself having to come away and then return so that I could kind of straighten my mind out in order to approach it, because I found it remarkably similar to icon drawing. You know, when you're doing images of the saints or something like that, there was an element of meditating upon the sacrifice, which is inherent to martyrdom. And so I found myself touching something I didn't expect in the context of a graphic novel, which I hope carries through into the reading for those who encounter it strictly as a reader, and maybe like me, coming from no knowledge about this particular story. One of the things that I really wondered about kind of coming into this was what does modern strategies look like? Because you mentioned promotion and it being difficult. What do modern strategies look like in a very sort of fractured media landscape? Because, again, independent authors, people working at small presses, getting stuff in front of people is really difficult. What do you feel like are the main pipelines that you do if you've got a message that you want to get out to an audience? What do you think some of those main pipelines are?
Yeah. I would say it changes depending on the audience that you're trying to reach, because some audiences, I mean, to your point about the fracturing of the landscape, some audiences are still primarily accessible through the legacy publishing institutions, the big publishing houses and their smaller imprints, or the corollary in the film industry would be the big studios and to some extent now streaming services. But then there are other audiences that's not primarily where they go for the content that they're seeking. They may be more online. They may be more in an independent space. They may be more accessible doing a self-publishing and self-distribution route. So it kind of depends on what audience you're trying to reach, and then discerning where are they, how do I get to them, and then once you've identified who they are and where they are, assessing the the most effective ways to be in touch. And it is hard with that fracturing, particularly if you're talking about outside of the legacy institutions that have a very clear conduit for their publication, their distribution, their promotion. Things online are more diffuse, and there's not necessarily a specific kind of journey to take, a specific strategy to follow. Sometimes you have to build it. And it's been interesting to see in the crowdfunding space, the particular creators who have been able to really succeed and to some extent even build a livelihood out of crowdfunding. It's a lot of work, and it requires someone with an entrepreneurial spirit. But for a creative that has that bent, it is certainly something to consider, is building your own following primarily online and using some of those platforms to reach them. And then one other strategy that I would mention would be if you don't have a following of that sort, but you can reach someone who does and associate them with your project in some capacity, then that can help get the word out as well. So it requires a lot of due diligence, a lot of research, and a lot of deep strategic thinking to assess who the audience is, where they are, and how to most effectively reach them.
That's affirmation for me, in the very least, because I start drawing like funny Greek myth comics, and then I meet Matt at a conference, and then a few months later I'm drawing this graphic novel. So there's this benefit to the entrepreneurial approach, which I think that's kind of where media is right now. It is a little more democratized than it once was, and there's space for stories like this one about Shahbaz, which is not something that might be easy to squeeze through like the main pipelines of traditional publishing, but definitely has an audience who would read it and enjoy it and be inspired by it. So that does seem to be, in my experience, so you're providing good affirmation for that, the sense that an entrepreneurial artist, entrepreneurial small groups of creators actually have space to do things now in a way that didn't used to.
Or even just this idea of how this whole process was so iterative and we didn't know the next step. So I knew Mandi knew Matt met you knew Ignatius, I knew the Bhattis. So like it's all, just hustle and going through the next door that opens up.
Yeah. It's definitely healthy, and this is another thing that a younger version of myself would have hated. Just willing to network and talk to people actually makes a huge difference, because I was much more content to hide in a room somewhere and just draw, and it turns out it's kind of hard to get things rolling if you take that approach. Matt, I know what a day looked like for me when I did this. There's a lot of ink stains on my sink, and there's a lot of
Mm-hmm. I think it depends on the stage that I'm in as far as the writing. Obviously, we've already talked about the accumulating information, getting to talk to the Bhattis. There was one biography that I had read, one decent biography that was written about him by a guy named John L. Allen Jr. But then there were ancillary articles or other books, like when we get to the part of the book about Asia Bibi and her arrest and being put on death row under the blasphemy law. There were a number of articles that I read, but I also realized a lot of these were slightly had a different take on the events that led to her arrest at the field that she was working in. And so I remember I needed a pause to read another book that was a French journalist that worked with her, with Asia Bibi, to capture a memoir for her. And so I read that whole book just for that one scene. So there's the accumulation of a lot of the background information. It's not that starts and then it stops and then you write. You're also still accumulating information as you go, But there is definitely the research phase, and then there's the outlining phase. And so the outlining phase, to me, that is the bulk of the work. That is the most important step, because now you're getting the 30,000 foot look as you're building this story, mapping out the 3 different arcs that we put into the book, with his early life, and then his advocacy stage, but then his government minister stage. Now those span a big chunk of his life, and then a lesser chunk of his life, and then a very smaller portion of his life. But mapping that out, both in sections and page by page, that was where a lot of the work comes in, because to my point earlier, what do we linger on and what do we run through pretty quickly was done in the outline stage. So there's days where I would just be sitting and mapping that out. And when I do that stage, it's really 1 to 2 sentences per page. Just, saying, okay, this is going to happen on this page, and this is going to happen on this page. And then there's trade-offs, because you and I knew how many pages we got total. So if I needed to linger, if I realized I need to spend a little bit of time on this, then that has to come to the expense of some other moment in his life. And then once that's approved, and everybody agrees, yes, this is generally what we want to do, then you get into the scripting, where you're breaking it down page by page, panel by panel, and writing this dialogue, the vast majority of which I don't have an accurate depiction of what did he say here or what did he say there. Sometimes there's news reports, or there would be press conferences that he would give that I actually did have an actual transcript of that, and so I could feed that into our scripts. But that was very little, so most of it was putting words in his mouth or the other people's mouths, the other characters, the other side characters that he interacted with. So some days it was outlining, and I'd spend quite a bit of time, working on that and trying to think of the macro and then mapping it out page by page. Some days it was deep into the script. Sometimes when you're in the script, you realize this is too much. Like, I've identified what's going to go on this page, but now that I'm fleshing it out in the script, I can't get it all in a page. Or if I do, it's going to be 12 panels. And I'm not going to do that to you. So this needs to be 2 pages. But then if I'm going to spread this out to 2 pages, that means it's got to be sacrificed somewhere else. What other scene can I shorten a little bit? Where can I make this a 6 to 7 panel page, and then spill over to the next page, make it a 6 to 7 panel page, and then again steal from another scene. So every day was a little bit different, but it was a lot more research, and then moving into a lot more outlining, and then moving into a lot more scripting. And so that was kind of the overall flow, if that makes sense. Now, again, when I would get to scripting, I now am trying to inhabit, Pakistan. And so that every now and then I am doing some deep dives back into some of the research. Now less to read about the story than some of the detail. What was it like in Pakistan? If I know what day she was arrested, for instance, Asia Bibi, let me actually just look up the weather in Pakistan, in that province, on that date. I can find out exactly what the temperature was like. So let me look that up. And so, I mean, even that is helpful for you, depicting it to get that granular level of detail, because, again, we're writing a true story.
Yeah. Is it hard? Because I'm assuming you get a...
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's not for me. It would be, I think, if I was an author artist, if I was a writer artist. And I know a number of people, I have friends in the industry with Marvel, with DC, with independents, who are both. I cannot draw to save my life. And so what I have always told people is, I do have an image in my head, but when I get the little Christmas present, which is I get a chance to open that email and I get to see what the art looks like, 99% of the time it exceeds what I could have even imagined. Very, very, very rarely is there occasion where I won't say I'm disappointed, but I'll see a detail that might be missing that it's important we get that detail in there. Yeah, so it is the joy of the writer to open that email and see the depiction. I can't even tell you how amazing it is to unwrap that Christmas present and see what you can do. Now, I don't get to see the process until I go to conventions, and usually when I table at a convention, and I've been very fortunate to sit beside artists who sit and paint and draw, for those next few days. And I get to see the magic happening in front of me. And it really is magic, because when I see, the process that you all go through, it is extraordinary. Starting with a blank page and then to see what you come up with. And to me, it is magic.
Well, that's incredibly magnanimous. I'm far too cranky and micromanaging to approach it that way. And maybe that's because I do the writing plus art. Well, I'm going to give another question for each of you, and I'm going to go to Knox last because I want to kind of give you the last word on Shahbaz. But let's start over here with Mandi. I was kind of curious throughout the whole project as to what were kind of the stories that inspired you to get into media in general. What's a little bit of the personal background? What's the stuff that made you think this is a thing that changes people, moves people, etc.? Was it books? Was it movies? Give me some specifics.
Yeah. Well, I grew up doing a lot of performing arts, so a lot of live theater, a lot of live vocal performance, but decided not to pursue that professionally. And after a couple of years of intense kind of academic work in undergrad, realized I was really missing that creative outlet. And so during my senior year of college, I wrote my first screenplay. That was the medium that I was most drawn to, I guess, from a kind of an impact perspective. And I had sort of followed participant media, which sadly no longer exists, but I was really intrigued by their model of what's been called edutainment in a way, where a fictional story is crafted to address or at least to include a very real topic, a very real kind of current issue. So I was aware of what they were doing, very intrigued, but it was actually seeing a film called La Misma Luna, which translates to Under the Same Moon, that really kind of clinched it for me. It was during that same senior year of college. Beautiful film that is about an undocumented worker in Los Angeles whose young son is still back in Mexico. She has moved to Los Angeles to earn money to send back for his care and his education. He's living with her mother. And at the start of the film, there's this sweet little conversation that they have. It's their Sunday ritual that she'll call the one payphone in town, and he's there to answer. And it happens to be his 9th birthday when he answers the phone, and they have a little conversation. And he's old enough to realize that she has made a choice to live in a whole other country, but he's not old enough to really understand why. All he knows is that his mom left him. And ultimately it becomes this beautiful kind of road trip film where he decides he's going to go find his mom. But it really humanized the issue of immigration, and particularly of illegal immigration for me. It complicated the conversation a lot more, because you can't remember or kind of have in mind a young boy in Mexico missing his mom and have the very siloed policy conversations, political conversations that often happens. So that film, I just found it so beautifully done and beautifully acted, and also really tough, complicating some of those common narratives that we can fall into, at least within the United States. And that for me was probably the best example, at least at that time, of the type of content that I wanted to make, that was both excellent in its craft, but also incredibly compelling and memorable. I don't want to make content that people forget. I mean, how many movies have I seen that it's like, oh, I think I saw that at some point, but I don't remember it. I don't want to make forgettable content. So that for me was kind of the path.
Matt, what about you in terms of writing? I'm assuming that there's influences that kind of pushed you this direction, and sometimes those can take the form of other writings, but they can also vary a great deal. So what do you feel like pushed you in this direction?
Definitely my upbringing of just being enamored with science fiction and then comic books at a pretty early, stage. I was reading Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov and a lot of the early science fiction stories. It kind of realized itself with my own pursuit into the Air Force. I mean, even my pursuit to go into the Air Force at the time was to be a pilot and to be an astronaut. I was compelled with a vision of the future that I wanted to live, but always drawing me was the story itself and the art form and these very human stories with larger than life, personalities and plots. And that's what comics gives you. It's epically big, but the ones you remember are the ones that are very human. That's why Spider-Man resonates, is because it's a very human story about somebody who regrets how his uncle died and his involvement in that and trying to atone for that. And so it is a human story, but with a larger than life, person and personality and plot line. So I was always drawn to that, even when I, kind of marched down this path of the military. And I just loved the idea of telling story. And then, of course, it occurred to me that Jesus himself was teaching over and over and over using parables, because they do touch people, they are universal, and they transcend time, right? And so we can study the parables to this day, a couple thousand years later, and still be touched by what he was teaching us. So that's really what kind of stuck with me to this day. Even seeing, I have twin boys who are 13, and seeing their love of story, I totally get it, and I've encouraged them to create their own stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we got to include some parables in the book, which one of my favorite parts was drawing those. It was
Yes.
because you go back to a story that you know really well from childhood, and suddenly, instead of thinking about it just as verses, I'm thinking about it as visuals. And that changed it quite a lot for me. I had not done that before. I hadn't gone through that process. So that was very effective. Well, Knox, there's a Jurassic Park effect, right? Where suddenly there was a bunch of paleontologists that spawned out of the Jurassic Park movie. So it's not just to the creative arts that it moves you. You went into a kind of policy that's centered around persecution and compassion towards the other. Were there media influences that pushed you that way?
Gosh, that's a great question. The first one that comes to mind is, just Dead Poet Society and this idea of carpe diem, seize the day, and this moment that we're given to live this life in a way that's positive, and I think as a Christian, we're called to seek ways to use the gifts we've been given to help others. I think as an American, just someone who's been blessed with immense liberties and prosperities, we can be a force for good in the world. And so a movie like that, just this, seize the day. How do we take advantage of this day to live it out to the full? And our kids just recently watched it, and it's still lands, right? The way it tells that story. So yeah, that one comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, right here at the end, when it comes to Shahbaz's legacy, if you could distill it, and you have a phrase like "seize the day" that comes from Dead Poet Society that becomes that. What do you think Shahbaz's equivalent of that is? Because this is clearly something that we hope has a similar inspirational effect as the things that have inspired us into the different paths of life that we've taken. So is there a way that you could distill that and put it into a form that you at least hope comes across through the book?
I think, people, I hope will take away, see an example of someone who laid it all on the line for a cause, but did it with a courageous conviction that honored himself, his faith, and those he was trying to help. That he understood politics, he understood how politics worked, and he would pull the levers he had access to try to move things in a positive direction for the cause he was committed to. He didn't seek the spotlight unless it was a way to advance the case of Asia Bibi, who was in jail, or others who were victimized. He looked to build bridges across faith, across politics, across religion and regions, and in our very broken world today, man, that is a model we should all just grab hold of, and try to do that as well, to work with others, both who are like us, but who are different than us, who believe in human dignity and believe in the importance of speaking out for those who are oppressed for what they believe.
If you made it all the way to the end of this, for one thing, congratulations. And for another, you should probably go outside for a bit. I'm sure it wants you to click another video for the sake of the channel algorithm. And I mean, click it, sure, hit pause, go outside, and then come back and watch it after that. Maybe after a couple of days, leave it paused for a couple of days, then come back and watch it.